So let's talk birthright citizenship. And I can't believe that we are debating this as a society, but yet here we are. On June 30th, the Supreme Court ruled in Trump v. Barber, striking down an executive order that tried to limit birthright citizenship for children born to parents who were undocumented or only temporarily present in this country. And the vote was 6-3. And the more I read about the decision, the more I realize we've had this argument before. See, in 1898, the Supreme Court decided a case called United States versus Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco. He grew up in America, but when he left the country and tried to return, the federal government denied him re-entry. Why? Because his parents were Chinese immigrants. The government argued that even though he was born in the United States, he wasn't really an American citizen because his parents remained subjects of China. Sound familiar? The Supreme Court disagreed. But beneath the legal arguments was a deeper question, one Americans have been debating for generations. Who belongs? Who gets to be considered part of we, the people? Looking at the text of the 14th Amendment, the court held that people born in the United States are citizens of the United States, regardless of the nationality of their parents, with only a few exceptions. For example, like if you are a child of a diplomat. That decision became the foundation of modern birthright citizenship. And this week, it became the foundation of the ruling that struck down the president's executive order. Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, he traced the practice of birthright citizenship all the way back through English common law, through the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, and through Wong Kim Ark itself. The government had argued that citizenship should depend on a child's domicile, on whether their parents had a permanent home in the United States. And Roberts rejected that argument outright. He said there was, in his words, scant evidence of that kind of reading. And what struck me, though, wasn't just the outcome, it was how familiar the arguments were. Opponents of Wong Kim Ark citizenship back in 1898 argued that the 14th Amendment wasn't intended to apply to immigrants. They argued that children inherited allegiance of their parents. They argued that some immigrant communities were too foreign, too disconnected from American life to be considered fully part of the nation. And more than a century later, the Trump administration made strikingly similar arguments. They argued that the 14th Amendment was meant to address the status of formerly enslaved people, not immigration. They argued that citizenship should depend more on the status of parents than on the place of birth. The comparison isn't perfect. In 1898, the debate centered on Chinese immigrants during the era of Chinese exclusion. Today, it centers on undocumented immigrants, temporary visa holders, and broad immigration questions. The legal theories have evolved, too. In Wong Kim Ark, the opponents focused on allegiance and parentage. Today, the argument turns on the meaning of the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof. The language is different, but the underlying question remains surprisingly similar, surprisingly familiar. Race is also less explicit now. In 1898, anti-Chinese racism was often stated outright in newspapers and politicians' speeches and law itself. But today, most opponents frame their arguments around immigration policy, border control, or constitutional meaning. But critics of those arguments often contend that anxieties about demographic change still play a role, just a quieter one, meaning they're not saying the quiet part out loud. And the meaning of citizenship has expanded. In 1898, the 14th Amendment was less than 30 years old. Today, birthright citizenship is woven into American identity. For more than a century, millions of Americans have simply assumed that being born here makes you American. Challenging that assumption feels far more disruptive now than it did then. The 14th Amendment was written after the Civil War because lawmakers understood that citizenship could not be left to the whims of politicians. If governments could decide that unpopular groups didn't count, then citizenship itself would become unstable. The amendment was in many ways a promise that being American would not depend on race, ancestry, religion, wealth, or whether the majority happened to like your community at a particular point in history. The court reaffirmed that promise this week, but the president's response tells you the political argument isn't over. Even if this chapter of legal debates may be. He called the ruling too bad for our country and argued Congress to take up the issue. That's unlikely to go anywhere given how broadly the public actually supports birthright citizenship, but it's a reminder that legal settlement and political consequences aren't the same thing. Now, every generation of Americans seems to revisit the same dilemma. When the country changes, do we redefine who belongs? Or do we reaffirm that citizenship protects people even when they're unpopular? Wong Kim Ark wasn't just about a Chinese American man. It was about whether citizenship would remain stable when public opinion shifts. And that's still the question that we have today. As we approach America's 250th birthday, that's a question worth wrestling with. After all, a nation founded on the idea that all people are created equal has spent much of its history deciding exactly who gets to be included in that promise. Every generation inherits the same question. Does the circle of belonging get smaller or does it get larger? In 1898, the court looked at a young man born in San Francisco, and said he belonged. And more than a century later, Americans are still debating what that question means. The name change, the immigrant groups change, the politics change, but the question remains, who gets to be part of the American story? And every generation leaves its answer for the next one. Thanks for listening. If you like this podcast, please subscribe wherever you are listening. And y'all have a great day. Happy 4th and Shabbat Shalom.